The HOA owns this lake, and if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." I had a folder in my hand. I'd kept it on my hospital bedside table for 3 months straight. I didn't open it. She had no idea what was in it. I'd been gone 15 months. My cousin had just driven me home from the rehab facility 3 hours on the road. Most of it quiet because neither of us quite had the words for what we were both thinking about. I hadn't even finished getting out of the car when this woman polo shirt HOA lanyard clipboard pressed to her chest like armor planted herself between me and the waterline and started telling me what I was allowed to do on my own property. My lake had a dock on it now. There was sand along the bank, real sand hauled in and leveled into something approximating a beach. 4 umbrella stations each tagged with a small Cedar Ridge HOA crest. A rope swim barrier stretched across the near end of the water. Picnic tables bolted into concrete footings, and people, a dozen of them at least. Towels and coolers and children in the shallows using my lake like it was a public park on a long weekend. I'd planted a willow tree at that spot the first spring I owned the place. It took me most of a Saturday morning to dig the hole right. The tree was gone. In its place, a dock with rope railings and a small weathered sign at the entrance to the planking life jackets required past this point, and at my property line, staked into the grass, I'd seated myself in white letters on HOA Navy Cedar Ridge, HOA Community. Beach residents and guests only. No private access. "That's my lake," I said. She laughed. Not nervous, not embarrassed, a full laugh. Like I just said something factually incorrect in a way she found mildly tiresome. "Sir, this lake was formally designated a community amenity at the March board meeting." Her tone was patient, the way people are patient with someone they've already decided isn't a serious problem. I know who told you it was yours, but if you don't leave this area right now, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Her name was Diane Pruitt. I didn't know that yet. What I did know was the type, and I'd known it the moment she started walking toward me. Behind her, a second board member had raised his phone and was filming the interaction. I looked at the folder. I didn't open it. I put it under my arm, pulled out my own phone, and started taking photographs. The sign, the dock, the umbrella stations, the sand, the full length of construction along my bank, the board member filming me. I shot all of it slowly, one frame at a time, with the focus of someone who was going to need every single one of these later. "You need to stop that," Diane said. I kept shooting. She stepped directly in front of my camera. "Sir." Every trace of pleasantness was gone. Her voice was flat and final, the voice of someone who was used to being the last word in every conversation within a quarter-mile radius. "The HOA owns this lake. We have the votes, we have the documents, and if you set 1 foot past that sign, I will have you arrested." She said it loud enough that 5 people down at the water had stopped and turned to look. One of them, a woman with a child on her hip, was watching with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not hostile, something more like uncertain. I studied Diane for a moment. Mid-50s, composed. The kind of person who had spent years being the most powerful authority in this particular stretch of suburb. She wore her certainty completely. It wasn't performance, she genuinely believed she was right. That was what I noticed most. I lowered my phone. "I understand," I said. I turned and walked back to the car. My cousin was watching me through the windshield, jaw tight. I got in, closed the door, and sat with the folder in my lap. The lake was right there through the glass. 11 years I'd owned that water. I bought the property for it, the view from the kitchen window on a clear morning. The way it went completely flat and glass-like in the last light before dark. When the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance 15 months ago, it looked exactly the way it always had. And at some point in the 15 months that followed, while I was in a hospital bed with no way to object and no way to stop it, someone had cut down my willow tree and built a dock on my lake. I called my attorney. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm home," I said, a short beat. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting." She had documents. She had votes. What she didn't have, what she had never once thought to check, was the county plat. Because if she had, she would have known that the HOA doesn't own this lake. I do, every square inch of it. And I'd had 15 months of silence to figure out exactly what I was going to do about that. I didn't say anything else. I didn't go back toward the water. I sat in the car and looked at the sign one last time through the windshield. Cedar Ridge HOA, Community Beach, with the folder sitting quiet in my lap. The people who built that beach had never once checked whose name was on the deed. My attorney's name is Robert Voss. He's been practicing real estate law in this county for 22 years, and he has a particular talent for staying calm in situations that would make most people want to put their fist through a wall. When I called him from the car that afternoon, he wasn't surprised by anything I told him. "How bad is it?" I asked. "They built a dock," he said. "Sand umbrella stations, the whole thing." I drove by twice after they finished. I wanted to see what we were dealing with. He'd been watching. He'd sent me the deed packet in the hospital, mailed it to my room, told the floor nurse it was important I keep it somewhere safe. At the time, I hadn't fully understood why. I understood now. "Tell me about her," I said. He told me about Diane Pruitt. She'd been elected HOA board president 4 years ago on a platform of what she called community standards enforcement. In practice, that meant a fine schedule that covered everything from grass height to the visible edge of a trash bin on collection day. She'd expanded the board's authority incrementally, each new rule small enough to seem reasonable in isolation. The whole stack adding up to something that felt, after a while, less like community governance and more like being managed. Residents had learned over time that pushing back on Diane came with a cost. Formal notices, elevated scrutiny fines that appeared in your mailbox 2 days after you said something she didn't like at a board meeting. 96 homes in Cedar Ridge, most of them had stopped attending board meetings entirely. It was easier. When I was loaded into the ambulance on a Tuesday morning in early February, the neighborhood knew within 48 hours. Word travels in a community this size. My property went dark, no car in the driveway, no lights in the windows, no movement. From the outside, it looked like an empty house next to a private lake. Diane had been watching that lake for 2 years. She told me so herself later, though, not in those words. The March board meeting, 6 weeks into my coma, lasted 40 minutes. I've since read the minutes 3 times. They describe my lakefront as the community access area adjacent to Lot 47, which is a careful way of not saying private property owned by someone who can't currently object. The motion to designate it a community amenity was introduced by Diane, seconded by a board loyalist named Craig Wellmont. 2 members voted against it. The minutes contain no attorney's name, no reference to a legal review, no documentation that anyone had checked the chain of title on Lot 47. The contractors arrived in April. They worked fast, 28 days from groundbreaking to ribbon. The HOA paid them $42,300, drawn directly from the Community Reserve Fund. That fund is built from monthly dues paid by all 96 homeowners in Cedar Ridge. Every family in the neighborhood contributed without knowing it to the construction of a beach on a private lake. In late April, Diane sent a community-wide email. The subject line read, "Exciting news, Cedar Ridge gets a community beach." The body included photographs of the finished dock, the sand, the umbrella row. It announced a ribbon cutting on Memorial Day weekend. It did not mention who owned the lake. Most people were pleased. A few were skeptical. One man asked 3 times. His name was Arthur Okafor, 71 years old, retired civil engineer, 19 years in Cedar Ridge. He lived 2 lots down from me, and had, as far as I could tell, been the only person in the community to ask the obvious question. He asked it at the April board meeting in an email to Diane directly, and again at a neighborhood social in early May. Had the HOA verified, it had the legal right to use that land. Each time Diane told him their attorney had reviewed the relevant property records and the board was in full compliance. She said it the way someone says something they know will not be followed up on, smooth, authoritative, slightly bored. Arthur didn't push further. He'd watched what happened to people who pushed. He kept a copy of the March meeting minutes anyway, filed it somewhere quiet, and waited. That night after the call with Robert, I sat at my kitchen table. The lake was visible through the back window, the evening going gold over the water. I could see the dock from where I was sitting. A couple of towels were still draped over the railing. Robert had confirmed what I already knew from the folder. My deed was clean sole ownership, no liens, no encumbrances, no easements of any kind. The lake had been deeded to my property 11 years ago. The HOA's governing documents, 47 pages, did not reference it once. He was pulling additional records. He would call me in the morning with the full picture. Before he hung up, he mentioned one more thing almost as an afterthought. There's a line item in the current HOA billing statement, he said. Starting June, every homeowner in Cedar Ridge is being charged $15 a month. It's listed as a beach maintenance fee. I sat with that for a moment. They hadn't just built on my property. They were charging 144 people a year to maintain it. Robert, I said, yeah, get everything. The notice arrived 3 days after I came home. It was printed on Cedar Ridge HOA letterhead, the kind with the logo centered at the top, and a footer listing all 5 board members' names. Slipped under my front door sometime before 7 o'clock in the morning, I found it when I went to get the mail. I read it, standing in the doorway. It cited Section 7.4 of the Cedar Ridge HOA, governing documents, a clause covering maintenance and upkeep of community amenities. According to Diane's interpretation of that clause, my presence at the lakefront 3 days earlier constituted unauthorized interference with a designated community amenity. My photographing of HOA facilities constituted harassment. Both violations carried a fine of $500 effective immediately, an additional $100 per day. For every day I continued to interfere. I read it twice. Section 7.4 is a maintenance clause. It exists to make sure someone cuts the grass around the clubhouse and replaces the lights in the parking lot. It has no mechanism, none, for applying to a piece of private property that was never designated a common area by any legal process in any recorded document anywhere in this county. They weren't just wrong. They'd put their wrongness in writing on official letterhead with a fine schedule attached, and they'd sent it to me as though it had teeth. I photographed both sides of the notice, emailed the image to Robert, and put the original in a folder of its own. That afternoon, Diane came to my door. She didn't come alone. Craig Wellmont, the board member who'd seconded her motion in March, stood just behind her left shoulder, hands clasped, watching. He had the energy of a man who was there to witness something he expected to go smoothly. Diane's tone had shifted from the confrontation at the lakefront. She was pleasant now, neighborly. She asked how I was settling back in, said she hoped the transition home had been comfortable. Then she said she wanted to find a way to resolve this quietly between neighbors before it became something more complicated. Her word for what she wanted me to do was accept the community arrangement. She framed it as reasonable, practical. She said the beach had been running since Memorial Day, that families had come to depend on it, that it would be disruptive to everyone, myself included, to reverse course now. I listened without interrupting. Then she added, almost as an aside, if this does become a legal matter, our attorney will likely seek to recover the full construction costs from you as the adjacent landowner. There's a reasonable argument that you failed to maintain an adequate safety boundary around the waterway, which created a community necessity. I looked at her for a moment. That argument doesn't exist. There is no legal doctrine that transfers construction liability to a private landowner because an HOA built unauthorized structures on their property without permission. She had either invented it herself or someone had told her it sounded plausible enough to try. I appreciate you coming by, I said. I'll be speaking with my attorney. Her expression stayed composed, but something behind it tightened. I want to be clear about the timeline, she said. If we don't have a resolution in the next 2 weeks, the board has authorized a lien filing against your property. A lien is a formal legal claim attached to the title of a property. It doesn't transfer ownership, but it clouds the record. It signals an unresolved dispute to any title company, any lender, any future buyer. Clearing one costs time and attorney fees, even when it has no legal merit. It is in the vocabulary of HOA enforcement a pressure tool, an inconvenience designed to feel like consequence. 14 days, she said. That's all I'm asking for. Craig Wellmont nodded slightly as though confirming the terms of an offer he'd already approved. I thanked them both, closed the door, stood in the hallway for a moment listening to their footsteps recede down the front path. Then I called Robert. He'd already read the notice I'd emailed, his assessment of Section 7.4 matched mine exactly. It was inapplicable to private property and could not form a legal basis for a fine or any other enforcement action. The line threat was more complicated not because it had merit, but because filing a lien is administratively easy and removing one requires a formal legal response. If they actually filed it, it would cost me time and fees to clear even with a clean deed. Are they going to file it? I asked. I think they'll try, he said, which means we need to move faster than they're expecting. He was already drafting a cease and desist formal notice that the lake is private property, that no HOA authority of any kind extends to it, that any lien filing would constitute a knowing misrepresentation of a property dispute and would itself become evidence in subsequent proceedings. While he drafted, I made a decision. I was not going to the neighborhood forum. I was not going to stand up at a board meeting and argue with Diane in front of 40 people. I was not going to leave angry notes or make calls to neighbors asking for support. Everything I did from this point forward was going to be documented, time-stamped, and usable in a legal proceeding. Every notice they sent me was evidence. Every conversation I had with them was logged. Every action they took against me was another brick in a wall its eye building around them. Diane's notice said I had 14 days to cease interfering with HOA property. My attorney sent her a response in 4. Arthur Okafor came to my door on a Thursday evening 4 days after I'd gotten home. He was carrying a manila folder. He was also carrying, I realized, when I saw his face, a significant amount of relief. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time to hand something to exactly the right person. "I'm glad you're back," he said. He meant it plainly without performance. I kept these. I wasn't sure why at the time. I just knew something wasn't right. He handed me the folder and I invited him inside. The folder contained a printed copy of the March board meeting. Minutes the meeting where Diane had moved to designate my lake as a community amenity. Arthur had printed them from the HOA's online portal the day after the vote and filed them in a drawer. He'd kept them with the quiet instinct of a man who had spent 40 years in structural engineering and understood that the load-bearing details in any document either hold weight or they don't. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and read through them carefully. The motion was described as follows: proposal to develop and designate the community access area adjacent to Lot 47 as a Cedar Ridge HOA recreational amenity for the benefit of all residents. That was the full description. No mention that the land was privately owned. No mention that Lot 47's owner was in a hospital and couldn't be reached for comment or consent. No mention of a title search, a deed review, or any legal consultation of any kind. The vote, 3-2. The 2 dissenting members had signed their names with what I imagined was the quiet resignation of people who'd been outvoted on something they knew was wrong and had no mechanism to stop. "I asked her 3 times, Arthur said. Every time she told me the HOA's attorney had reviewed the property records and everything was in compliance." He paused. I should have pushed harder. "You asked 3 times, I said. "Most people didn't ask once." He nodded, but I could see it hadn't fully settled for him. He was the kind of man who held himself to a standard that didn't leave much room for partial credit. I called Robert that night and read him the key language from the minutes. He was quiet for a moment, then, community access area adjacent to Lot 47. A deliberate reframe private property described as though it were already shared space, the kind of language that looks like carelessness if you're feeling charitable and looks like something else entirely if you're not. There was a second detail buried in the minutes, a line authorizing Diane to retain contractors and disperse payment from the reserve fund directly without a full homeowner vote. Cedar Ridge's governing documents require a community vote for any reserve fund expenditure exceeding $10,000. The beach had cost $42,300. No vote was ever called. That clause existed for exactly one reason: to stop a board president from spending other people's money on something they hadn't agreed to. 2 days after Arthur's visit, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Marcus and Jess Beaumont, first-time homeowners, 8 months in Cedar Ridge House on the corner of the main loop. They'd seen me at the property the day I returned and had been working up to reaching out since. Something had been bothering Marcus since construction. He worked in commercial construction himself and work sites post permits always. He looked for the posting every day for 28 days and never found one. They were both willing to put that observation in writing. I thanked them and forwarded their contact information to Robert. Meanwhile, Robert had filed a title search with the county recorder. Results came back in 48 hours. My name sole owner, clean chain of title 11 years continuous. The lake was not a public waterway, not a shared easement, not a common area under any designation. And the HOA's governing documents, all 47 pages, contained zero reference to the lake. Not a clause, not a footnote, not a single passing mention of the waterfront adjacent to Lot 47. There's something clarifying about that kind of absence. It's not ambiguous. There's no gray area to argue over, no interpretation that cuts both ways. The HOA had no partial claim, no arguable foothold, no procedural fig leaf of any kind. They'd spent $42,000 of other people's money constructing infrastructure on a piece of land their own documents didn't acknowledge existed. I sat at the kitchen table that night with everything spread in front of me, the meeting minutes, the title search, the contractor authorization, Arthur's account in his careful engineer's handwriting. It wasn't a large stack. It didn't need to be. Each piece did one thing. It removed one more leg from under the story Diane had been telling. I wasn't angry the way you might expect. I was something quieter than angry, more like decided. I want to do this once, I told Robert when he called to check in. I want to do it right. I want it to stick. It'll stick, he said. Then he paused. One more thing. They've retained outside counsel real estate attorney. Notice filed this afternoon. They're preparing to formalize their claim. I looked at the stack of documents on the table. Good, I said. The call came on a Monday morning. Robert's voice was measured. He has a particular way of delivering bad news that keeps you oriented even when the situation genuinely warrants alarm. He said HOA's outside counsel had filed a formal petition in county court the previous afternoon. The legal theory was called implied easement by community use. I asked him to explain it plainly. He did. When a piece of land has been used openly, continuously, and without objection by a group of people for an extended period, a court can sometimes recognize an implied right of access even without a written agreement, even without the owner's consent. The argument HOA's attorney was making was this 15 months of uninterrupted community use of my lake with no recorded objection from me, as the owner had created an implied right of access that the HOA could now assert as permanent. Put more plainly, because nobody had stopped them for over a year, they were claiming the right to stay. Forever. Is it viable? I asked. Robert paused, the specific pause of a man choosing his words carefully, because the honest answer is more complicated than a simple no. It's a real legal doctrine, he said. Courts have upheld it in the right circumstances. The argument isn't frivolous. I thanked him and said I'd call him back. I didn't call him back that day. I needed a few hours. That night I sat with the full weight of what permanent loss would mean, not catastrophizing, just honest accounting. The beach would stay. Strangers would have legal access to my water every summer weekend for as long as I own this property. The view from my kitchen window on a quiet morning, the particular stillness of the lake at dusk, all of it converted permanently into the backdrop of someone else's amenity. I could own the land and still lose it in every way that mattered. I let myself sit with that. For one night, then I called Robert in the morning. He answered before I'd finished forming my first sentence. I've been up since 4, he said. I found something. He'd pulled the state property code and gone through the implied easement doctrine section by section, working backward from the specific facts of my case. The doctrine has conditions, specific enumerated conditions that all must be met for a claim to hold. And one of those conditions made Diane's entire case a structural impossibility before it even reached a judge's desk. He told me to write it down. Implied easement by community use requires as a foundational element that the property owner had knowledge of the use and failed to object. Knowledge and failure to act. Both elements must be present for the easement clock to legally run. I had been in a medically documented coma for the first 5 months of the HOA's use of my lake. Legally incapacitated, I could not receive legal notice. I could not object to anything. I could not act in any capacity whatsoever. Under state property law, a person in documented medical incapacity cannot be held to have failed to object, because the legal standard of failure requires the capacity to act. The clock cannot run against someone with no capacity to stop it. HOA's entire legal theory required an owner who was present aware and simply chose to say nothing. I had not been present. I had been unconscious in a hospital. The argument failed at its foundation. "That's our answer," I said. "That's our answer," Robert said. "But we don't show it until the hearing." 2 days later, Arthur Okafor forwarded me an email Diane had sent to all 96 homeowners in Cedar Ridge. Subject line, "Protecting your beach legal update." The body described the HOA as having taken proactive legal steps to preserve this beloved community amenity in the face of an attempt by one returning resident to privatize it. She used the phrase 96 families twice. She said the board was confident in its legal position and expected a resolution affirming community rights within weeks. She did not mention that the property was privately owned. She did not mention the 3-2 vote with no legal review. She did not mention the $42,000 drawn from the reserve fund without the community vote her own governing documents required. What she did was reframe everything. I was no longer the man whose lake had been taken while he was in a hospital bed. I was a returning resident trying to take something away from his community. She was getting to the 96 homeowners, first shaping the narrative before the hearing, before anyone had the information to see it differently. Arthur's message below the forwarded email said only, "Thought you should see this." I forwarded it to Robert with a single line, "Add it to the file." Then he told me one more thing. The HOA was drawing on the reserve fund to retain outside counsel, the same fund that had paid $42,000 to build on my property without my consent. 96 families contributing their dues every month, and their money was now being used to fight the man whose land they had occupied. I thought about Arthur, who had asked the right question 3 times and been told the same lie each time. I thought about Marcus and Jess Beaumont 8 months into their first home, paying into a fund they had no idea was being used this way. "Robert," I said, "schedule the hearing." "Already started," he said. "Prepare everything. Deed plat meeting minutes, county records, contractor invoices, the incapacity documentation, all of it, all of it." I looked out the window at the lake, the dock, the umbrellas folded down for the evening, their HOA crests barely visible in the fading light, the sign at the property line. Their attorney had filed a motion to give the HOA permanent access to my lake. My attorney had found the one paragraph in state property law that made that motion worthless, and Diane had no idea it existed. The meeting was called for a Thursday evening 8 days before the county hearing. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in Cedar Ridge by then through Arthur, who forwarded the community notice with no comment attached. The subject line read, "Important HOA, update your beach, your rights." It requested all residents attend an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse 7 o'clock, light refreshments provided. I told Robert I was going. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know," I said. I arrived 5 minutes early and took a seat in the back row against the wall near the door. The room filled quickly, more than 60 residents, one of the largest turnouts I'd ever seen in this community. People were standing along the side walls. Someone had set out folding chairs that hadn't been there at the start, and those filled too. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in years. I recognized people who'd been using the beach. I recognized the young couple from the corner house, Marcus and Jess Beaumont, sitting together near the middle, close enough to the aisle to leave if they needed to. Arthur was in the center of the room, about 8 rows from the front. He didn't see me come in. Diane stood at the head of the room with a projector screen behind her and a printed packet on the table at her side. She was composed in a way that went beyond preparation. She had the settled confidence of someone who had already decided how this evening would end. A board member I didn't recognize sat to her left. Craig Wilmot sat to her right, hands flat on the table, watching the room fill. She started at 7 o'clock exactly. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I know it's a weeknight and I know you're busy. I asked for this meeting because I want to look every one of you in the eye and tell you personally we are going to protect this beach." Someone near the front started to clap. Several others joined. She let it settle before continuing. What followed was 20 minutes of the most polished thing I had watched Diane Pruitt do. She walked the room through a timeline displayed on the projector, photographs of the construction, the ribbon cutting on Memorial Day weekend, children at the dock, families at the umbrella stations. She talked about the process of developing the beach, described it as something the community had been asking for, and that the board had worked hard to deliver. She used the phrase community investment 3 times. She talked about the legal action in the language of defense rather than offense. The HOA, she said, was protecting a beloved amenity from being privatized by a single returning homeowner. Their outside attorney had reviewed every aspect of the situation, and the board was in what she called a very strong position. She cited the 15 months of open, peaceful, continuous community use as though it were an established legal fact that a court would simply acknowledge and move on from. She did not say the lake was privately owned. She did not say the March vote had happened with no legal review and no attorney present. She did not say the $42,000 had been drawn from the reserve fund without the community vote her own documents required. What she did instead was smile steadily warmly at a room full of people who had been told exactly enough to believe she was fighting on their behalf. I sat in the back row and watched. A few people glanced toward me over the course of the meeting. Some once, some more than once. A woman 2 rows ahead of me turned, looked and turned back. No one said anything. I didn't react to any of it. I had my hands in my lap, and I was paying attention to every word Diane said in the way you pay attention when you're keeping a record. When she opened the floor for questions, Arthur raised his hand. "Diane," he said from the center of the room, with the same quiet precision he'd used the 3 times he'd asked this before. "Could we get a copy of the legal opinion that cleared this, just so homeowners have it for reference?" The room shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight collective stillness, people waiting to hear the answer to the question that apparently needed asking. Diane held his gaze. "That falls under attorney-client privilege," she said, "but I want to assure everyone in this room that our legal position is solid." Arthur nodded and sat down. 3 people within my line of sight exchanged looks. Not loudly, no one said anything. No one stood up to follow up. The moment passed the way small doubts pass in a room that isn't yet ready to become a conflict. But it had passed. The question had been asked in front of 60 people, and the answer had been privilege rather than a document. Diane closed by announcing that the hearing was scheduled for 10 days from now. She told the room they nothing to worry about. She told them the community had done everything right and the law would recognize it. She thanked everyone for their time and their trust. Her eyes moved to the back row once near the end. She found me without looking for me the way you find the thing you are already watching. Her expression didn't change the same composed confidence, the same certainty that she was the last word in the room. I held her gaze for a moment, then I looked away first, not because I was retreating, but because I'd seen everything I needed to see. I stood, caught Arthur's eye across the room and gave him a single nod. He returned it. I walked out through the door I'd come in and let it close quietly behind me. Outside, the lake was visible at the end of the sloping grass in the last of the evening light, still and flat and dark blue going to gray. A few HOA-branded towels were still draped over the dock railing left from the afternoon. I looked at the sign at my property line, Cedar Ridge HOA Community Beach, white letters on HOA navy, exactly as it had been the day I came home. Diane had closed the meeting with a smile. She told 60 people the hearing was 10 days away and they had nothing to worry about. Standing there in the dark at the edge of my own property, I thought, 10 days is exactly enough time. The county hearing room was smaller than I expected. It was a standard administrative chamber, 12 rows of gallery seating, a raised platform for the hearing officer, 2 tables facing forward with chairs for counsel, institutional carpet fluorescent light, a wall clock that clicked audibly every 60 seconds, the kind of room where things get decided without ceremony. I arrived with Robert at 8:15. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:50, the gallery had filled more than I anticipated. Arthur was there, 3rd row center. Marcus and Jess Beaumont sat 2 seats from him. Several other Cedar Ridge residents I recognized had come, some who'd been using the beach regularly, some I didn't know well. Diane sat at the opposing table with Craig Wellmont beside her, and HOA's outside counsel, a compact, precise man named Gerald Foss, arranged to her left with a stack of tabbed folders. She wore the same composed certainty she'd carried into the community meeting. She did not look at me when I sat down. The hearing officer called the room to order at 9 o'clock. Gerald Foss went first. He was organized incredible 15 months of open continuous community use, documented with photographs signed in logs from 2 community events and 2 resident statements. He argued the HOA had acted in good faith and that the law recognized this kind of established use pattern as creating a legitimate implied right of access. He concluded cleanly and sat down. The hearing officer turned to Robert. Robert straightened his jacket and placed 2 documents on the table. He didn't open with argument. He didn't address the implied easement theory. He picked up the first document and said, "This is the deed to the property recorded with the county 11 years ago. The sole owner of record is my client. The lake is not a public waterway, not a community common area, not an HOA amenity under any recorded designation. There is no easement implied or expressed anywhere in the chain of title." He set the deed down and placed the county plat beside it. "This is the county plat. It shows the precise boundary of the property, which includes the full lake. We'd like to establish these 2 facts before we address anything else." The hearing officer reached forward and examined both documents. Gerald Foss looked at the deed. Then he looked at his tabbed folders. He began turning pages carefully, steadily, with the particular focus of a man searching for something he was no longer confident he had. Diane looked at the deed too. I watched it happen. Not a collapse, something slower than that. The certainty that had been the fixed point of every move she'd made for 15 months shifted almost imperceptibly, like a foundation settling under weight it wasn't built to carry. Her posture didn't change, her expression didn't break, but the quality of her stillness changed from the stillness of someone in control to the stillness of someone holding very carefully together. Craig Wellmont beside her stared at the table. Robert turned to the implied easement petition. He said the doctrine requires as a foundational element that the property owner had knowledge of the community's use and failed to object. Both elements must be present. He placed a third document on the table, my medical record subpoenaed and certified, establishing the precise dates of my hospitalization and the legal designation of medical incapacity throughout. My client was in a documented medical coma from the first week of February through the following May. He was legally incapacitated. He could not receive legal notice. He could not object to anything. Under state property law, the easement clock cannot run against an owner with no legal capacity to act. The HOA's entire theory requires an owner who is present and chose to say nothing. He was not present. He was unconscious. Robert set the medical record beside the deed and the plat. The claim fails at its foundation. Gerald Foss stopped turning pages. He looked at the medical documentation. He looked at the hearing officer. Then he set his pen down on the table in front of him, not dramatically, just set it down and sat back in his chair. In the gallery, someone exhaled. Craig Wellmont leaned toward Diane and said something in a low voice. She didn't respond, didn't turn her head. Robert picked up the HOA's March meeting minutes. He walked through them methodically. The 3-2 vote, no attorney present, no legal review, documented, no title search ordered, no notification to the property owner or his emergency contacts. He directed the hearing officer's attention to the language used to describe the lake community access area adjacent to Lot 47 and noted that it described a privately owned lake in terms that obscured its legal status entirely. The board. President told this community on at least 3 documented occasions, and in writing to all 96 homeowners, that the HOA's attorney had reviewed the relevant property records and determined the board was in full compliance. Robert set down a final document, a letter on his firm's letterhead. We contacted every real estate attorney in this county and the 2 adjacent counties. Not one has any record of being retained by Cedar Ridge HOA in connection with this matter. There was no legal opinion. There was no review. There was no attorney. The room went still. Not the anticipatory quiet of before. Something different. The stillness of people absorbing something that couldn't be walked back. 60 people had sat in the Cedar Ridge clubhouse 8 days ago and heard Diane say, "Attorney-client privilege," when Arthur asked for the legal opinion. The same 60 people, or most of them, were sitting in this room now. Arthur Okafor sat with his eyes closed for a moment, just a moment, then opened them and looked straight ahead, jaw set. Jess Beaumont's hand found Marcus's arm. The woman 2 rows behind Diane, one of the 3 who'd exchanged looks at the community meeting, stared at the back of Diane's head, with an expression that had moved well past doubt and arrived somewhere harder. Diane had not moved. She was looking at the surface of the table directly in front of her. The composed certainty that had carried her through 4 years of board meetings and 60 homeowners in a clubhouse in the opening of this hearing was gone. What remained was someone sitting very still in a room that had reorganized itself around her without asking permission. Gerald Foss requested a brief recess. The hearing officer denied it without looking up from his notes. Robert introduced the contractor invoices, last $42,300 from the Community Reserve Fund, authorized by the board president directly, without the homeowner vote required by Cedar Ridge's own governing documents for any reserve expenditure exceeding $10,000. He stated this would be the subject of a separate civil proceeding for restitution and damages, and that board members who individually authorized the expenditure might face personal liability. Voss said nothing. He had his hands folded on the table, and he said nothing. The hearing officer ruled from the bench. The implied easement claim was denied. The lake was confirmed as private property. The HOA held no rights of access express or implied. All structures constructed on the property without owner consent, the dock, the sand installation, the umbrella stations, the picnic tables, and the sign at the property line were subject to removal within 30 days at the HOA's expense. A separate civil proceeding was opened to address damages and the question of reserve fund misappropriation. In the gallery, I heard the sound of people beginning to talk quietly. Not cheering, not applause, just the sound of a room where the pressure has come off and people are turning to each other with the thing they just understood. Robert gathered his documents. I sat at the table and looked at the deed and the plat map and the medical record arranged in a quiet row in front of us, telling the truth, waiting for someone to ask. The contractor arrived on a Tuesday morning. I watched from the porch with a cup of coffee. They came with a flatbed truck and a small excavator, 4 men who worked without conversation, moving from the umbrella stations to the picnic tables, to the dock in a methodical progression that suggested they'd done this kind of work before, removing. Something that shouldn't have been there in the first place has a particular quality, less like demolition, more like correction. I didn't go down to the water while they were working. It took most of the day. By mid-afternoon, the dock was down. The sand equipment loaded, the umbrella bases pulled. The sign came. Last 2 men worked the posts out of the ground with a breaker bar, then lifted the panel and laid it flat in the truck bed, white letters facing down. I watched until the truck pulled out of sight. Then I went inside. The civil proceeding took 6 weeks to settle. The terms the HOA would bear the full cost of removal. The contractor bill came to just under $18,000, drawn from the same reserve fund that had paid to build the beach in the first place. On the misappropriation claim, the $42,300 spent without the required homeowner vote, a settlement was negotiated that included partial restitution to the reserve fund. The portion Diane had personally authorized fell under her director's and officers' liability insurance policy. She had taken out that policy as a matter of routine when she joined the board. I suspect she had never imagined it would be used this way. The $500 fine was formally vacated. The lien threat was withdrawn and documented as withdrawn. My title was confirmed clean, no open disputes, no clouds, nothing. Robert called when the paperwork was signed. He said, "It's done." I said, "Thank you." We hung up. The petition appeared in my mailbox 12 days after the hearing. It was a formal request for a special HOA meeting signed by 61 of the 96 homeowners in Cedar Ridge. The stated purpose, a vote of no confidence in the current board leadership. The signatures were on 3 printed pages gathered in 11 days. I recognized Arthur's handwriting at the top of the first page. The Beaumonts were there. Near the bottom of the second, a woman I'd seen at the community meeting, the one who'd been staring at the back of Diane's head when Robert said there was no attorney, had signed in the upper right corner of the second page with a hand that pressed firmly enough to leave an impression through to the sheet beneath. The special meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I didn't go. I didn't need to. Robert called me afterward with the results. Diane Pruitt, Craig Wellmont, and the third board loyalist were voted out by a margin that left no room for interpretation. The two dissenting members who had voted against the beach motion in March, outvoted then quietly right all along, remained seated. Arthur Okafor was elected interim board president by acclamation. Robert said the room had applauded for a while. In the days that followed, several residents came to the door or sent messages. Some I knew well, some were near strangers. They said they were sorry not for what they'd personally done, because most of them hadn't done anything wrong. They were sorry they hadn't pushed harder when they had doubts. A few said they'd known something was off from the beginning and hadn't said so loudly enough. I told them all the same thing. It was done now. Marcus and Jess Beaumont sent a handwritten note on a card with no occasion printed on the front. Marcus wrote that he'd driven past every day during construction looking for permit postings and never found one. He said he should have asked louder. Jess had added 2 lines below his in different ink, that they were glad I'd come home, that Cedar Ridge was better for it. I kept the card on the kitchen counter for a while. 2 weeks after the structures were gone, I walked down to the lake. It was a morning in late autumn, cool and still, the kind of light that comes low across the water and makes everything look deliberate. The sand had been largely cleared, the ground regraded to something close to its original slope. The spot where I'd planted a willow tree that first spring was bare ground now, the soil still settling around the absence. I didn't look at it long. I sat down on the grass at the edge of the bank, the same angle that put the far end of the lake exactly in line with the tree line on the opposite shore. The same spot where on a clear morning you could watch the water go completely still right around dawn before anything disturbed it. No dock, no umbrellas, no strangers, just the lake doing what it had always done on its own time at its own pace, with no HOA crest attached to it. I sat there for a while. There. I fought for the water. The water had always been mine on the deed on the plat in the county record. What I'd fought for was the right to sit here on a Tuesday morning and hear nothing. No voices carrying across the bank from someone else's afternoon. No dock boards shifting in the current. Just this. He got it back. At the property line, the post holes where the sign had stood were still visible, 2 dark circles in the grass, 4 inches across where the concrete footings had been pulled. I looked at them for a moment. I didn't fill them yet. They could stay a while longer. Some reminders earned their place.